You should be grateful. You have it better than anyone in human history.
This is the most dishonest, disgusting lie told by boomers and corporate shills to try and gaslight Gen Z into accepting the horrible economic conditions they created without even asking questions. But fear not, Gen Z, as your millennial defense lawyer. I got your back, and we're going to expose these corporate boomer lies once and for all. If you actually do even a bit of research into human history, you'll quickly see that not only does Gen Z not have it better now than ever, Gen Z actually has by far the lowest wages when adjusted for inflation in the last 100 years at least. And yes, I am saying this being fully aware that the Great Depression was less than 100 years ago. Gen Z's wages today are literally worse than those who lived during the Great Depression, and you'll soon see how. We'll get to the Great Depression era soon, as I'm sure you're all very curious about that. But first, let's start off with more recent memories and work our way back. Part 1. The 2008 Financial Crash. If you're a Zoomer watching this video, you've probably spent a lot of time wondering how things got this bad. It all started in 2008 with the economic crisis that would come to define our lifetimes. I'm a millennial who, as luck would have it, just happened to graduate high school in 2008, and I remember just how bad things were like it was yesterday. Before 2008, it was actually easy to get a job, even as a high schooler. Not only that, but rent was very cheap back then, and it was common for 18-year-olds to be able to afford a small apartment with a roommate. I had a friend my age who worked at a local cinema, and he noticed something was very wrong when one day a middle-aged man wearing a suit came in not to watch a movie, but to apply for a job. They ended up rejecting his application because he had a master's degree and was overqualified for the job. I personally had a very strange experience when I turned 18. Back then, the culture and mentality around work was very different than it is now. The crash had just happened, and people still expected you to get a job when you turned 18. I remember applying for literally hundreds and never getting a reply. And everyone around me thought I was just lazy for not wanting to work, even though I was desperate for a job. Pretty much the exact same situation I'm sure a lot of you Zoomers can relate to today. Despite how bad things were back then, I can still unequivocally say that Gen Z has it much worse today. Although getting a job was impossible back then like it is now, rent and living expenses were much cheaper and more bearable. My first apartment was a pretty spacious 2-bedroom for $600, which I split with a roommate for $300 each. Compare that to today's average rent prices of $1,739, and it's unquestionable that Gen Z's effective wages are way worse than even those of millennials like myself, who came of age in the 2008 crash. Here's what's even crazier. Despite the fact that rent and living expenses have soared like crazy since 2008, minimum wage is still the same dogshit $7.25 an hour. Even without adjusting for this insane inflation, wages are not much better now than they were back then. Part 2. 1990s to 2008. Gen Z's wages are the worst in 100 years. This is the title of this video, and I'm aware it's a very bold statement to make. So, before making this statement, I actually took the time to do some due diligence and actually research the last 100 years. The last thing I want to do is to be like the very delusional boomers I'm attacking for just throwing out mindless statements like, "You kids have it better now than ever," without even doing any historical research to see if it's true. The 90s are universally regarded as one of the best economic times in human history. The economy was booming under President Clinton, and prices of everything from rent to gas to food were insanely cheap. This is why millennials are so nostalgic about their 90s childhoods. But it is important to be historically accurate and point out one thing. From 1990 to 1991, the US and the world did enter a brief 8-month recession where unemployment rose to nearly 8% in the US, 20% in Finland, and led to the Canadian Prime Minister at the time being forced to resign. But per usual, as with most recessions, inflation actually went down, and those who kept their jobs had no problems paying their bills. These less than satisfactory conditions were actually what led to Bill Clinton's election a year later. This recession is actually considered relatively mild by historical standards, so there's not really any argument that things were worse back then than they are now for Gen Z. The fact that recessions lasted less than a year back then is also mind-boggling to us Zoomers and millennials today. I just wanted to point out this fact to be honest and objective, and not just assume everything was sunshine and roses every year in the 90s. Part 3. The 70s and 80s. Although the economy was stable for the most part in the 70s and 80s, both decades were marked by pretty severe recessions in their first few years. The early 1980s recession was particularly bad, and actually had a lot of striking similarities with the awful economy we live in today. Inflation in Canada was 10% in 1980, 12.5% in 1981, and 10.8% in 1982. In the US, it was even worse, at a staggering 13.5% in 1980. These numbers are actually quite similar, perhaps even a bit worse at face value than the inflation numbers we see today. Though I suspect, as I'm sure many of you do as well, that there's no way the government is being 100% honest about the inflation figures today. And in both eras, the 80s and the modern day, unemployment was rampant, and it was impossible to find a job. If I switched sides and I was a boomer who wanted to argue that Gen Z has it better than ever today, I would absolutely use the early 80s recession as my best argument. But unfortunately for my hypothetical boomer self, I would still lose that argument, and here's why. Just from face value comparing wages relative to rent costs between now and the 1980s, we see that it's not really even close. Minimum wage was $3.10 per hour, while the average rent was once $243 a month. This meant that a full-time minimum wage job paid about twice as much as the average rent per month. Which isn't great, but it's certainly way better than today, where average rent prices are over 1.5 times the monthly minimum wage. Keep in mind, we're only talking about minimum wage here. If we were to include middle-class jobs that require a college degree, it would be exponentially worse for Gen Z when you account for the insane student loan debt you have to go into to get a degree these days. The early 70s had a similar period of stagflation with the early 80s, where unemployment and inflation both went up at the same time. But inflation wasn't quite as bad as in the 80s, which you can see in this chart right here. The post-war era, 1940s to 1960s. There really isn't much of an argument here. This was the booming post-war economy that boomers grew up in, which is how they got their delusional viewpoints. That hard work always pays off. Well, it certainly did in that era. This was arguably the best economic time in human history, as the average boomer had the privilege of being able to buy, not rent, but buy an entire house with just 2 years' worth of the average salary back then. When boomers constantly tell us we have it better than anyone in human history, I wonder if this is ultimately just a massive projection. Because if you actually look at numbers, data, and historical research, instead of just mindlessly throwing out that statement, you'll see that they're the ones who actually had it better than anyone in human history by any metric. It's undebatable that the post-war economy was better than today. Not even boomers themselves would dispute that. But exactly how much better was it? In 1960, the minimum wage was $1.61 per hour. This doesn't sound like much until you see that the average rent back then was only $71 a month. If we quickly do the math, we'll see that minimum wage was 3.6 times the average rent. Compare this to today's rent to minimum wage ratio, we see that rent today is 150% of a full-time minimum wage salary. This means that young boomers had over 5 times the purchasing power Gen Z has today. And again, this is only factoring the minimum wage. If we were to factor in middle-class jobs that require a degree, it gets even more grim when you consider the insane costs of college tuition Gen Z faces today that boomers didn't have to deal with. We all knew boomers had it better, but it even surprised me to see that they had it 6 times better. The Great Depression. Yesterday, I just made a whole video comparing life in the Great Depression compared to what Gen Z faces today. After doing a lot of extensive historical research, I ultimately came to the conclusion that Overall economic conditions were slightly worse during the Great Depression because of the lack of safety net back then. But this video is about wages and not overall economic conditions. Unemployment was a staggering 25% back in the Great Depression, but if you were one of the 75% who had a job, things were actually quite a bit better than they are right now. I'll show you a quick clip from yesterday's video that perfectly explains this. If we take a look at other cost of living metrics outside of rent, it gets even worse for Gen Z. Sugar cost 59 cents for 10 pounds, vitamin D milk was 50 cents a gallon, ground coffee cost 39 cents per pound, bacon was 32 cents per pound, and eggs were 18 cents a dozen. For those who could win a place, tuition at Harvard cost $420 a year. Even if we adjust for wage differences, it's absolutely no contest. The average salary back then was $1,731 back then, meaning an average salary was enough to rent a house, pay all your own food and bills, buy a new car, and go to Harvard with absolutely no student loan debt. Raise your hand if you're a Zoomer who would take that deal. Yeah, I'm pretty sure every Zoomer just... So, yes, you heard that right. Even during the Great Depression when wages dropped 42% in a year, they still had significantly better purchasing power than Gen Z has today. That's just how bad boomers screwed up the economy. Conclusion. So, when was the economy and purchasing power actually worse than today? As you can see, I'm very passionate about discussing these issues, but I'm also very honest and objective. The 100 years number wasn't just a nice round even number I picked for the title of this video. It's actually based on historical facts and research. To find a time period where inflation is as bad or worse than it is for Gen Z today, you have to go all the way back to the World War I era, where between 1916 and 1920, inflation rose at a staggering over 20% a year. That means, in a short 4-year period, prices for everything essentially doubled. This is because World War I caused a huge shortage in both labor and production, and as a result, prices absolutely skyrocketed. We saw this most pronounced in the infamous Weimar hyperinflation of Germany, where at one point a dollar was worth a mind-blowing 4.2 trillion German paper marks. In case you're wondering what wages were back then, unfortunately, I really tried, but it was almost impossible to find official statistics on it, as it kind of was just way too long ago. But given how bad just how inflation was, and that there was a literal world war going on, I think it's safe to say things were at least close to as bad as they are today. And this kind of proves the whole point of this video. You have to go back over 100 years to an era where there was literally a world war going on to find a time where purchasing power and wages were worse for young people than they are today. Earlier in this video, we briefly touched on the Great Depression era video we made. It's a really interesting video, packed with a bunch of historical facts and analysis. You can check out that video in the link right here. I'll see you there.